that EU leaders have approved moving on to the second phase of Brexit talks after sufficient progress on the divorce bill. That from the President of the European Council, Donald Tusk, and he's been tweeting about that in the last few minutes, saying EU leaders agree to move on to the second phase of Brexit talks. Congratulations, PM Theresa May. So, expected but significant, with a well done to Theresa May there. Let's get more with my colleague Christian Fraser, who's in Brussels.
Yeah, isn't that tweet interesting? And again, it reinforces this point I've been making over the last day or so, that they are giving personal credibility to Theresa May for what has happened over the last 2 weeks. There was speculation that she would come here bruised and undermined by what happened in the Commons on Wednesday, and they are perfectly aware of the difficult mathematics back home in the House of Commons and the difficulty she will have bringing Remainers and Brexiteers around a format for the next stage of the negotiation. But they think that she was instrumental in getting the deal across the line. They've helped her along the way as well, which tells us that the European Union do want a deal. They've moved deadlines. And as the British side have been briefing in the background of this summit, there were concessions made on the EU side as well. Concessions on the UK side, but also concessions on the EU side. So a lot of credit going to Theresa May, and of course she got a round of applause, polite applause it has to be said, but nonetheless a round of applause in the room last night. Well, let's speak to Maria de Mertzis. She's the Deputy Director at the Brussels-based economics think tank Bruegel. It's very good to see you, Maria. They're obviously have got past the rubber stamping of the agreement right at the beginning of their 2-hour meeting, and now they move on to the next bit of the discussion, and that will be really setting the terms for the next phase of the negotiation and principally the transition. What do you expect they will come to an agreement on when it comes to the transition?
Well, I think in terms of options that are available to us, so literally I think there's only really 2 options. The first one is the kind of relationship that we have with Canada, that's the CETA agreement. But the only thing about the CETA agreement is it does not allow for a relationship on the financial services, and the UK would be looking for something like that. So if the UK wanted to negotiate a CETA type of agreement, it would require something additional, so we call that CETA Plus, that will require something on the financial services. Or we could have a type of relationship like we do with Norway and Liechtenstein, which is a lot more inclusive, but it has the additional point that the 4 liberties of the EU, they need to be respected, and that of course includes the free movement of people. Now, I'm not entirely sure how that is going to play in the UK conversations, and on top of that there is the additional problem of what happens with Northern Ireland.
Yeah, well, let's take the transition part first of all. Given that they want to keep Theresa May in place, they've obviously set down fairly narrow parameters for the transition, that Britain will continue to abide by the rules of the single market, the European Union and the jurisdiction of the European Court. But given that this is going to go on till 2021, they also have to give us something to be able to sell to the Brexiteers. So will there be wiggle room in the negotiation on that particular part?
I suppose there is room to negotiate everything, but to be entirely honest with you, I find that there is little willingness to invest capital for anything else than the final agreement, so the future relationship. This is where all the capital is going to be invested, and therefore spending time on negotiating something that is going to last us for 2 years, I don't think people are waiting for this. We're going to have about a year to negotiate the defines of a broad agreement that's going to take us to October 2018. Then the rest of the time is needed to ratify the agreement, and that's just procedural. And then after that, it's all about putting the details on the future agreement, and that's not going to be an easy thing. There's going to be a lot of discussions about that as well. In parallel, to think of changing the transition deal as a transitory process, I find that very difficult to believe, and I'm not surprised that the EU is insisting on the UK actually following all the rules while they are in that transition phase.
Well, I do appreciate that, but at the other side of the transition period in 2021, there is then a cliff edge. And what the UK would be saying, I presume, in the negotiations is you have to enable us to hold discussions on future trade deals with other countries. You have to be able, we have to put things in place for registering EU migrants. There are things that the UK will want to do so that when it comes to the end of that transition period, they're in a place to go forward.
I agree with you. I think these are very reasonable requests. I'm hoping that this will be part of the discussion, but they will be starting from a very negative position to try and improve on that. I hope some of this happens, and we have actually seen even in the divorce discussions that the EU gave some concessions, and there were important concessions, and there were reasonable demands that came from the UK. I hope that spirit continues, but in terms of investing capital on achieving certain things, I think there will be very little of that.
Theresa May, for all the confusion over what she actually wants, some people who studied it will say, well, actually, she's been very consistent all the way back to Lancaster House. She has said that the UK is leaving the single market and the customs union. Michel Barnier said last week, well, if that's the gun she's sticking to, that means that it can only be Canada Plus. Now, if it is going to be Canada Plus, can you stay in full alignment with the European Union? Because they have signed up in this first part of the agreement to full alignment.
Yeah, I think you can. The interesting thing about this option, the CETA Plus, is what happens to services. I think this is the bit that the UK will be seeking to clarify, because the CETA agreement is really only about goods, it's not about services. And this is an important component of the British economy that it will be very difficult to give up. So I think this is the sticking point as far as I can see.
Okay, Maria, thank you very much indeed for your thoughts. Let me just remind you that they have then moved past the first part of the negotiation. The test of sufficient progress has been met. We have seen a tweet from the European Council President Donald Tusk, who says EU leaders agree to move on to the second phase of Brexit talks. Congratulations, Prime Minister Theresa May. We are incidentally expecting a press conference from Donald Tusk and Jean-Claude Juncker a little later, and also Angela Merkel and Emmanuel Macron will give a joint press conference together as well. So maybe we'll get some more detail on what they're expecting and what they've agreed in this meeting for the next phase of the negotiation, Anita.